two, one, two, three.
Hello and welcome to Ithaca DSA Presents. I'm Theresa Alt. I'm here today with Jack Mallek. He's a member of Cornell Young Democratic Socialists of America, and he has been looking into labor history and has read a book about some interesting goings on the West Coast in 1934. Jack Mallek, why don't you say what it was?
The West Coast Maritime Strike and sort of contained in that the general strike was part of it was a general trend within the American labor movement from 1933 to 1934. Starting in there's the West Coast Maritime Strike is one of the sort of three big strikes of the year 1934. The other two being the Minneapolis Trucker Strike, also known as the Minneapolis General Strike, and the Toledo Autolite Strike. In 1933, strikes had really taken off in the United States, and they had largely all been crushed, pretty violently as well. It was there's an old American Civil Liberties Union report about the year 1933 that says, despite the passing of this, pro-labor legislation from Congress and the president, 1933 was the worst year for labor rights on record. More people were, locked up, beaten up, killed in strikes than any other year that we have on record. So that's the ACLU in 1933. It was only in 1934 that some of these strikes actually started winning. And this was one of the big ones.
What were the issues on the West Coast?
On the West Coast, the conditions, well, it depended. There's two sort of groups involved in this strike, right? There are the longshoremen, there are the dock workers, and then there are also the sailors who are managing all these shipping vessels. For the longshoremen, it had a different mechanism for hiring than what we normally associate with wage labor. It's honestly more similar to slavery in a sense that like every day the dock workers they have to go out to the docks and there are a bunch of recruiters that are looking over it. There might be jobs for like 100 people that day and there'd be 500 people out there. And so they'd all have to get in line and wait out in the dock all day and maybe get like 2 to 3 hours a day if they're lucky. And because of this, there's a whole system of essentially like recruiting bosses, where if you wanted consistent work, you had to essentially pay them bribes, treat them like some sort of master, buy them drinks, like show like extreme deference towards them. And for this, you are given the privilege of having consistent and longer hours of work, for one of the most strenuous industry that exists. There was considerable speed up in the industry, sort of preceding the 1930s, and in order to avoid paying like overtime wages, the bosses would, work these people to the point of collapse a lot of the time. You'd see like having dock workers like collapse like due to heart seizure was not an uncommon a not uncommon thing to see. Um, so yeah, it's divided between like those who spend considerable of their own very meager salaries to get guaranteed employment from these recruiting bosses, versus the vast majority. And essentially, because they have consistent work, almost working themselves to death, and then the vast majority, which most of the time, like it's incredibly uncertain if you're going to work on any given day, but you have to stand out on the docks all day to even try to get employment. It's just extremely bad conditions. So that's the longshoreman, or that's the dock worker side of this. On the other side of it, you have the seamen, the people managing or running the ships that are coming and delivering cargo. Their conditions are also very bad, but in different ways. Just on the ship themselves, the conditions are very bad. You might have like 30 people crammed into like an extremely small room, like barely enough room for them, like just all in these big bunk beds, all side to side, with oftentimes like these dorms would be below deck. So when the ship is carrying cargo, there would be no outside ventilation. You couldn't like the decks would be below water, so they are extremely cramped, extremely small quarters with no outside ventilation. And in addition to this, like the discipline for, maritime workers or sailors was extremely harsh. It was, basically is comparable to prison conditions that they were living under while they were on a ship. And because of essentially like a process of industrialization, automation, um, the the dock workers had less and less time. Like when a ship was unloading while the sailors were while the ship was in harbor, the dock workers, the whole unloading process had gotten so efficient that a lot of these sailors, like you'd have at most a couple hours not at sea, and then you'd be back out. This is in contrast to what it used to be, where you had much more time to, have a life off of like have a life on land. Well, this is, more and more disappearing. You had it so that these people essentially couldn't raise families, or at least it would be extremely strenuous to, because you would just not be able to see them for almost like it was rough for both groups of workers. It was regarded as some of the worst work of any industry, and people were sort of advising their daughters not to associate with any of these people because it was considered like, almost criminal underground elements would be the only ones who would work there, or something like that. That was the stigma, both, on board the ships and on the docks and off. So.
What were the ports where this strike took place?
So the strike started on San Francisco, but it would expand to a bunch of other ports along the West Coast. So the first strike location was San Francisco, but this spread up to places like Seattle, places like Portland, and also Los Angeles. Also had like a significant strike wave there. Although Los Angeles, it was more difficult to maintain the strike than in other locations because the docks were more spread out than in San Francisco. In San Francisco, you had essentially like all of the docks concentrated along a single strip, whereas in Los Angeles, they were much more spread out. So it was more difficult to maintain pickets.
And
But yeah,
understandable. And what was the union?
so there were, I think there's a distinction between like official union in charge of this and what was actually like the organization that was doing this. All of so this was in 1934, or at least the preparation for the strike started in 1933. But like at that time, there was no CIO, there was no Congress of Industrial Organizations. It was all of the unions were affiliates of the American Federation of Labor, which was a terribly conservative union. So their unions were the International Longshoremen's Association and so that's the ILA, and the International Sailors Union, I think, the ISU. Both of those were AFL controlled, but most of the organizing was not done through the actual unions. because AFL unions were horrendously conservative. And this is a general trend within the strike. And essentially, all of the other big 1934 strikes is that the AFL leadership would do everything that they could to make sure a strike did not happen. And if a strike did happen, they would do everything they could to essentially sabotage it. That was mostly the role of the AFL. So if when you're talking about leadership of the strike, most of the leadership was done through sort of like rank and file committees and organizations that were actually like directly elected from the membership rather than with the AFL, where I'm not sure about the specific cases of these unions, but I'm pretty sure that they were appointed directly from like the AFL, like central committee or whatever it was. A lot of these places, like there was no democracy, there was no real control over things like strike decisions or whatever, that like these were extremely undemocratic unions and that they would use a lot of their efforts was not so much organizing the strike as trying to prevent it and sabotage it.
Some echoes of that today when we hear that it is very important that rank and file, rank and file caucuses or whatever take over their unions
No,
and
exactly.
really start
Um,
to.
yes, no, exactly. This has been a problem in American labor for like it's a long time. It's essentially as old as American organized labor itself. Modern like the CIO was sort of organized as a reaction to the conservative, like very narrow-minded craft unionism of the AFL. And it had more of a left-wing element, but especially after World War II, a lot of the more left-wing, more rank and file centered leaders were either purged as like communists or communist affiliates, or sort of more constrained and pressured to more sort of conservative policies. And so there was like the CIO was formed as like a reaction against the conservatism of the AFL. But after World War II, there was sort of a counter revolution within the CIO, which got the two eventually to merge into the AFL-CIO.
Say a little about how the strike unfolded,
Cool.
what actually happened.
The strike started essentially, well, the first semblance of organization, the conditions, the labor conditions in San Francisco in 1933 were that there was only one union and it was a company union. I think it was called the Blue Book, or at least that's how it was referred to, I think, by the longshoremen. So the first attempts toward organization took the form of a leaflet or publication that essentially was telling the longshoremen everything that they already knew, right? The conditions are bad that we need to do something about it. And this gradually emerged into people started organizing the Industrial Longshoremen's Association, which is like sort of an informal, they were organizing into the Industrial Longshoremen's Association. At the time, the bosses they would just refuse. It started to get going, but then the bosses blacklisted anyone that joined the ILA, and so they appealed the case. At the same time, in 1933, the National Industrial Recovery Act was passed, and in it, it had a provision that said workers have the right to organize and bargain collectively, and that this, right is cannot be impeded upon by like bosses or employers, intimidation, things like that, right? This is part of like the first wave of Roosevelt's New Deal. The government did not really enforce this, and it didn't have the means to. But it was used especially in the early waves of this to say you are preventing like you're discriminating against union employees. You have to stop. They appealed this up to the Labor Mediation Board, and they won the hearing. Like, if you remember this, the company does not have the right to discriminate against you. This really helped explode the membership, and they start having these sort of rank and file meetings about a list of demands. And primary amongst them was a closed shop and a union hiring hall, because I think the main demands were a $1 an hour wage, and a union hiring hall, a closed shop, because the life of a longshoreman was you spend all day on the docks, you maybe get hired, you maybe don't. It's all like it's under extremely strict control of the employers. There's extreme uncertainty among any dock worker, and so their major demand was to get a closed shop, to get rid of this like shape up system, and make sure that these people had a regular source of employment, to make sure that you don't have this absurd system where like a dock worker doesn't know if they'll have any hours of work the next day or next week even. Those things started to get organized, and eventually after like waves of like mediation and then negotiation and then mediation again, in early May, I think May 9th, um, they go on strike. And pretty soon after they go on strike, they're joined by the Teamsters go on a sympathy strike. They refuse to deliver any goods to or from San Francisco Embarcadero, which is the major dock area, major waterfront area. Like this is very important. Throughout this whole time, like in the lead up to the strike, the bosses are saying like, "Oh, we have all these strike breakers at the ready." They don't. Almost all like the vote for the strike is overwhelming. Like overwhelming numbers of longshoremen are joining in on this strike because the condition, like what they're demanding is like everyone wants it. The author of what was it the Big Strike? He says like he's talked to like he presents like the ILA version of events, the Industrial Longshoremen's Association or the International Longshoremen's Association version of events, and he presents the company version of events. And he goes like he tries to find he interviews some dock workers or whatever, and he said he after interviewing so many people, I could not find a single dock worker that supported like the employer's view of this. Everyone like it was nearly unanimous. And then now all the after a while the ships start being like parked in the harbor, and for the first time the sailors get to come offshore and like talk to each other as like a mass group. And this is when the sailors and seamen they join as a specific block in solidarity with the longshoremen with the Teamsters, all as essentially a block. They have their own demands. They're all striking together. That's the first wave of the strike. And then after that, it's essentially round after round of the same sort of rigmarole. It's trying to appeal to like more conservative leadership, either in the federal government or in the ILA leadership, appealing for like some sort of settlement that grants slight like wage increases, but does not address the central demand of the closed shop. They do this with the Associate Secretary of Labor, or it's Edward McGrady. After a while, the bosses were like, saying, "Oh, we need to have a joint meeting of Edward McGrady, the Associate Labor Secretary, and Joseph P. Ryan, who is the president of the International Longshoremen's Association." In the meeting, eventually only McGrady comes because Joseph P. Ryan, the strike is essentially spreading out from San Francisco. Dock workers across the West Coast are all striking, and Joseph P. Ryan, the like ILA representative, he's on the West Coast trying to make sure the strike doesn't spread eastward. He wants to make sure it's contained to the West Coast, and so he's not in the first round of negotiations. But anyway, there's a whole settlement of like they try to negotiate a settlement. It's negotiated over the head of the rank and file. The rank and file reject it. It just happens over and over and over again with the Associate Labor Secretary, the president of the ILA, until eventually, like things come to a head on sort of July 3rd. The protests are getting sort of more violent. There's a sort of temporary truce, but on July 5th, the cops and the mayor had said on July 5th at 8 a.m. the port is open. We're clearing the strike. We're letting the scabs and business will continue as usual. And the way they do this is a mass assault on an assault on the workers. At 8 a.m., the police start firing pistol rounds into the crowd of strikers at the Matson line, part of the I think southern part of the Embarcadero. They start spraying tear gas. The like as a direct assault. There's like in the strike. This is the police had been sort of skirmishing with the strikers. This is the first open direct assault. They're firing live rounds of ammunition at them. The strikers retreat, and they eventually come back to the ILA headquarters. And this is in the downtown city. This is like not the Matson line where the attack first commenced. That was sort of like in a less populated industrial area. They now retreat to the center of the city at their headquarters, but then the police attack this as well. They start throwing. They called it vomit gas, stronger than tear gas, aerosol poison or whatever. Like they throw it through the windows of the headquarters. They're firing live rounds of ammunition at these people in their own headquarters. They once again retreat. They try to set up barricades. The police start firing. Like they're retreating through the streets. The police start firing at them despite there being like a whole civilian population around. In total, over 100 people were wounded from this, and two people were killed. And all of the headlines that were reporting on this were talking just about how much blood there was on the streets of San Francisco. And it would be later called Bloody Thursday. That was a real turning point in the strike. And for a while, it really galvanized opinion. There were fewer and fewer people who were supporting it halfway. You were either fully for it or fully against it at that point. And this is when the demand for a general strike started to gain traction.
The general strike being a strike by organizations all over San Francisco.
Yes, not just Teamsters, not just the dock workers, but say for instance like streetcar workers or butchers or machinists or et cetera, et cetera, like those sorts of people, like of all working men in the city. And Bloody Thursday was the impetus for all of that. Labor had to respond. After that, it was just such a brazen assault that after that point, like the rank and file were almost unanimous. We need a general strike to respond. How that actually happened, it was interesting. It was so the AFL at that point realized that they could not, they tried as best as they could to avoid a general strike. They tried as much as they could to argue that it's if for like Teamsters specifically, right? Like, oh, it's against your our contracts, it's against the laws of the international union, et cetera, et cetera. Like all these ways to try to dissuade workers from the general strike. It was not working. The support for a general strike was extremely high. At that point, the AFL, they could no longer prevent a general strike. It would happen whether or not they were with it. So this tactic changed. Now it's not make sure one doesn't happen, but try to retain control of one. They appoint a general strike committee. It was not elected, but it was appointed essentially by the AFL. And this was the organization that was going to be in charge of the general strike. Bloody Thursday was the 5th of July, 1934. Now, throughout this whole period, there were quite a few days where business was returning to the docks with the very inefficient, very costly scab labor. It was not doing very well. But the strike was not happening for a couple of days. On July 12th, the Teamsters voted to go out all on strike, against the wishes of their own president. Like they are all going out on strike. A good part of the general strike starts here on July 12th, July 13th with the Teamsters. Some 200 butchers walked out on strike. The tram workers also walked out on strike. You had a considerable part of the working population was already out on strike by July 13th, which is a day before the general strike committee would call for a general strike. That general strike committee voted on July the 14th for a general strike on the 16th. But again, as things were coming closer to the general strike was essentially completely in effect on the 15th. And then we have the day, July 16th, the official start of the general strike. On that day, essentially the industry of the entire city shut down. The machines were all essentially quiet. All of the restaurants and taverns and stuff, a whole bunch of them are closed. And the ones that were open would say things like, or they would be closed to things like, we support our boys, fight to the end, that sort of thing. And the ones that were open were said open by the authority of the General Strike Committee. At this point, you have an extreme polarization of public opinion. On the worker side, they're obviously very much pro the general strike. On the side of like the middle class elements, they are extremely freaked out by all of this. And the entire press is sounding the alarms that this is a movement controlled by, this is a communist insurrection. This is a revolution. They're trying to overthrow the US government. That like they sound the alarm that there's a 5,000 man strong communist army coming to take the city. Never happens. Like it's just so much like a lot of middle class people
Yeah.
lock themselves in their apartments because they're afraid that if they ever set foot outside, they're going to be shot, which again is completely untrue. This is
Well, how did it end?
Okay, how did it end? All right, so after a while, essentially through a settlement with the General Strike Committee, the General Strike Committee is divided between sort of like more radical elements that want to push the strike further and have the strikers organize public services so that they can hold out for longer and for victory. The conservatives want to sort of slowly wind back business activity and slowly wind down the strike. And eventually, essentially, the business or so the more conservative elements of the General Strike Committee end up prevailing. After a while, after a couple days, they allow the trams to start back running again. Slowly, like they allow more and more restaurants and businesses to open back up, and all of this shows that like okay, the strike is winding down. And so I think after 4 days, the general strike is called off, but the maritime strike is still on. The way that they settle this is by each sort of striking, like both the longshoremen and the seamen are apply for unconditional labor arbitration by the National Recovery Administration, to which the longshoremen get a pretty good deal. They get a 6 hour day, 30-hour work week, sort of a joint control hiring haul, which again was less than what they wanted. That was their one central command. They did not exactly get it. The seamen they did not get very much, like they got a much worse deal. They got pay increases, but again, not terribly much. A lot of the seamen still had wages of like $45 a month, which is in accounting for inflation, I think that is somewhere around like $1,000 or maybe $1,500 a month. Like it's very it's still not great. Like it's an improvement from what they were getting previously, which was uh, could be as low as $20 a month. But again, it's far from what they demanded. Um, and throughout the entire strike, there had been very strong by the rank and file. There's a very strong insistence that the seamen and the longshoremen are together, that there cannot be a settlement um, just for the longshoremen. Um, and the thing that was eventually accepted was better than the previous things, which was just settlement for the longshoremen and nothing for the seamen. But it was sort of short of the true solidarity because now there was a strong division between longshoremen and seamen. The seamen were very much still had terrible working conditions, whereas the longshoremen had maybe not a great deal, but a pretty good deal. And that was like a sort of um, put hampered their unity in the future when working for these sort of things. So anyway, yeah. Sounds good.
Thank you, Jack Mallek,
Sure.
for a lot of interesting info about the West Coast dock strike. This has been Ithaca DSA Presents. I'm Theresa Alt. Thanks for watching.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3.